got such a heavy lead. Beautiful day today out in the woods, and I only have time, I don't know, for maybe a couple of trees today. Even though it's gorgeous, I have some other things I have to deal with, family related. And so as I was coming out, I saw an ash tree over there, which is probably dead, next to a leaner, so I figured maybe I can do a 2-for-1 and get them both. The other thing is, since I don't have time to fool around, right? The 394 didn't make the cut, and it's got some development that it needs to happen. And I wanted to talk about that at some point in time anyway. You know, the concept of a total saw build, where it's not just about performance, it's about usability out in the woods. Now, I used to make videos where that was a theme, and had brought that concept into the conversation probably 2016, 17 time frame, where you build a saw that is, yeah, it's fun to run, but it doesn't have any shortcomings that you have to work around just because it might be a faster than usual saw. The kind of things that might be is things like a bling buck and spike, which is too long, or a muffler which rolls into the wood, or something like that, because those are the kind of things which turn it from, in my mind, a work saw into a play saw. You know what I'm saying? If you got to work around the characteristic of something you just created in order to get your job done, it's really not a work saw. You're doing it for fun. There's nothing wrong with that. You know, some guys like to do that. You know, then they just modify their technique to work around whatever it is they've created. And there's not anything wrong with that. It's just not what I do, and it's not what the people in my world want. So I had gone that direction for a little bit with bling saw and stuff like that, with its filter hanging out, and you know, and went away from that. I went back to where the saws that I've built, both for myself and for the people who I serve, are, you know, designed to be tools where I enhance a characteristic they happen to like, but I don't detract from the saw's ability to perform for a long period of time, you know, doing the jobs that people are doing with them. And for me, it's things like this. Making sure that the air filter is in fact covered. You know, so if it rolls off the tractor in the wintertime, I don't get a whole bunch of snow and mud in the air box. So saws like my 2165, that's a bling saw. That's a fun saw for me, but it's not something I can really work with out here in the wintertime. You know, the 2175, in fact, is a work saw, where I kept all those kind of things intact. And the muffler mod also was done in such a way where it wasn't going to create problems. It was out of the way, it blew chips out of the way, and it's not going to get enough garbage in it if it rolls off the bucket of the tractor to create a problem for that saw. And it starts, it's mostly OEM. It may not win any cookie cut races, but it does cut better than a stock 2171. It's got more torque, and pulls a longer bar a little bit better, and it's more custom for the work that I do, and that's the point. That's the total saw concept for me, is enhancing a tool. So for me, the guidelines are trying to make enough power without detracting from the reliability, and the characteristics that I try to enhance are less weight with things like a light bar, and more bottom end torque with things like compression. And I sacrifice possibly RPMs in how it looks, stuff like that. But the saws I've built over the years, they're still out there. They're still making money. I think I want to go back to 562 for a little bit to try to go one size smaller. And then my bling saw 562 had to punch to pull a 24, even a 28. But it's off doing other things right now. Are things that I know are going to work. And one of them, believe it or not, is that saw. We'll test it, right? We're still testing, so always an optimist. To this point in time, it hasn't let me down. But that saw is a proven work saw for me. And this is what I was talking about. You know, it may be subtle changes, but they're significant enough for me. And they work well in my system of the system that I've developed to maintain my wood lot and harvest trees. That saw is a winner, whether it has a 24 or 28. Like the 28s now, because the trees I've been cutting to this point have been larger. But if I get back down into trees like this, 20-inch trees, 15-inch trees, I'll be right back to a 24. When I'm scrubbing around on the ground, less weight's better. Less things that, you know, to run into things and have to manage is better. I'm kind of in that mode. Now that saw there, the work I was doing yesterday, I'll show some because I want to show what a saw that doesn't work looks like, and that was the 394. It was it's not developed, and it's funny because there's some things it has people would desire. For example, the bucking spikes on that 394 are about to here. I want to get a set like this because it's just too much leverage. They actually come down to here. So you have that moment arm right there just to jam that bar right into the wood. And that's fine when you have big, giant, heavy bark, pine type trees where you actually do need the leverage just to get those big bars moving. But also, because of the bark, you're not getting in close to the hard stuff. You need a big bucking spike to get through that bark. But out here, I've got this for bark. You know what I'm saying? So a shorter bucking spike actually is an advantage to me. So believe it or not, one of the enhancements I'm going to make to the 394 in order to make it fit my world will be the Holzfforma bucking spikes like that are on this g395, just because of the kind of bark I have. Isn't that strange? What a turnaround, you know? So this is actually not the woods that I'm focusing on. I just found a couple of trees that I think I need to take. This is a woods I had harvested about 2010, I think. Yeah, 10, 11, 12, that time frame. And it's coming back really nice, actually. It's really coming back pretty nice. You know, or what I did was, well, I got that tree that needs to come down. That's a dead one. But a lot of the other trees grew quickly once they had more light and resources, you know, because they're not competing with the other trees. I thinned it out, and man, they've responded beautifully. So this is where I want to end up with the woods out in the back that right now looks like carnage, and the woods where I'm going to be going, which is about a quarter mile that way. That is very mature, looks beautiful, but right now the big trees are crowding out all the new growth, so I want to thin that out some. But I don't know, maybe I should take that one too. See, I'm leaving a lot of that stuff because I really want to get better quality wood up for the first couple of loads. Because there's this cluster, I never really got into it. When I see a cluster like that, I'll pick one or two out. I'm not going to take them all, obviously, but I'll take a couple of them out in order to let the other ones grow. That's the game. But anyway, that's what we're doing today. My goal was 4 trees. And I don't have time to mess around, so I'm taking proven work saws. That's my backup. We're testing that because it's been proven to be a good work saw. So let's start out by getting it going. In the culture we have online right now, you know, it's about how fast it can cut in a cookie. You know, and I understand that. At some level, that's a tangible way to define a saw. And I have to confess, there was a time where I spent an awful lot of time comparing cookie cuts from one saw to the next, because when I had made a modification, that was a way for me to quantify whether or not it was a success. Over the years, through the feedback from my customers and stuff like that, I began to realize that that is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. And they really didn't care whether or not the particular modification I made that saw 1/10 of a second quicker, you know, or even 4 seconds quicker in a 30-second cut. It just didn't really care. I mean, it was really cool the first time I ran it because it had that nice snappy feel. But what really mattered to my people and to me now is, does that saw perform in a consistent way day in, day out? And can I depend on it to do the job, especially when I'm time crunched? You know, kind of like today. Better tighten up that chain just a little bit. So what happened was the cookie cut mentality kind of took a back seat to making practical changes that enhance a particular characteristic, which makes my life a little bit easier. And that's where we are now. And that, to me, is the genesis of the total saw concept, you know what I'm saying? Where when you're done, you've built something that actually enhances your quality of life, makes the job that you have to do a little easier. Let's see if I can get this saw to start. Now notice my muffler mod doesn't really, any way, shape, or form hurt how I would operate the saw, because in fact it blows the chips away from me, and I can rock that saw and it's not going to come up and hit the muffler in a reasonable rocking rotation. It's stuff like that what I'm talking about. Alright, well, let's start. This is a big saw, and I'm an old man. If it fires, that's the kind of thing that makes it a nice saw for me, because it's a tough one to get going. And the least amount of effort I can put into it, the better. One thing I found with this saw here, it's very easy to overchoke it. Of course, one of the concepts that I've been trying to talk about for a long time is not just a total saw, where there's a lot of different things you have to consider when you're developing or choosing the saw for a particular type of work. But there's a whole job concept, a total job. And like here, because I don't have my winch just yet, I'll have it on in a week or two, I've got to plan how to take those trees down, but also how to actually harvest them, how to get them up and out of there. So you got to plan the entire job from, you know, the equipment that you're going to use to cut the tree down, which is what we like to focus on, but also the overall job, the work site, and how to actually get the trees out of there. So when you're looking at these saws, you know, there's a cost, and you can distribute that money across ever faster hot saws, or you can distribute that money into other things like winches and, you know, chains for your tractor and all that type of stuff in order to actually be able to perform functions that are useful. So when I do my saw builds, obviously I'm trying to keep the cost down, you know, just not do extravagant things because of bling or because they're cool or unique, but also in mind is trying to keep the resources to where they can be used on things like choker chains, you know, fuel, diesel, stuff like that, to enhance not just the saw, but the entire process of getting the wood on the ground to getting it processed to either firewood or selling logs. And that's something we don't talk about much. The actual saw in this process right here is what we're interested in. And in the past, that's what was the focus of my videos, right? Building saws and making them faster, and the clone saws and all that. But in fact, They're a pretty small part of this. I might spend 15 minutes in cut time, but I'll spend an hour, hour and a half in getting those trees up the hill. So, something to consider, but that also works into the total saw concept. Is why would I do saw builds which actually make the process harder? You want to make it easier. That's the definition of a good built saw, is one that fits into that overall operation and adds value to it versus on the altar of faster cookie cuts, online appreciation and kudos and looks. May serve a purpose that way, but actually hurt the ability for it to justify itself out in the wood by either a premature failure or, you know, adding something that actually makes it harder to function, that makes it harder to actually do the work. You know, that's the definition of a bad build to me. So anyway, the aftermarket saws, where that came into play is I got into that because of a guy who liked to crush saws with a skidder, and that was a low-cost way of bringing a saw back into service. That's where it started for me, and that fits into the total job concept because he can either spend lots of money on the OEM parts that look better quality, or he can get by with the aftermarket parts, get the saw back into service where he was making money. And guess what? Now we're running aftermarket saws, and that one right there is doing just fine, thank you very much. It costs probably $400 to replicate that versus $1,300 to buy one of those new. Something to consider. Alright, on these trees, I don't have to do the bore cut from the front like I normally do. I can just do a normal hit. This one here, I'll do a bore cut from the front because it's an ash tree. That one's not, you know, it's not going to create a problem for me. So I'm just going to take it with a normal conventional hinge. And that'll be good enough. Why I don't use a Humbolt type cut on these is I want to get it as low as possible. So I kind of do like a modified one where I do come up a little bit so that I have a surface that the log will skid over when I start pulling it up out of that swamp. Which is why I cut those stumps. But now I got a bore cut.
Well, we may have to help it with a wedge. That's why they're there. There it goes. Right down the middle. Boom. Now, how the hell am I going to get it out of there? So before I contemplate that, but notice on this tree here where it didn't pull much because it's not an ash tree. And my rule of thumb is if the pull is going to be, you know, somewhere around the trim wood in depth, I don't really care. I'd rather have the hinge to direct the tree like we just did there and get exactly where I wanted it. I didn't even hit that tree over there. I want to go right down the middle, right where it is. So that's one criteria. But with the ash trees, you know, especially that one where I'm going to have to wedge it over, I need to get into the heartwood, because if my hinge is a little further back out of the trim wood into the heartwood, it will pull. It'll take out a foot, foot and a half of that log. And what happens is over a period of time, you know, it adds up. You know, like this right here, you know, I lost about 4 inches on that stump because I couldn't get the saw a little lower. That's good enough. I'm fine with that. I'll deal with that. It's fun running that particular saw. And on that one there, it'll be the same because that stump is not so good anyway. But if you think about it from the perspective of every 4 to 6 inches on a tree adds up. You know, 10 trees at 60 inches, you know, 100 trees at 600 inches. It begins to add up over time, and that's why you want to take that kind of a cut. And the other thing is the open face. If you look at the geometry of that, you lose some of the trim wood, but you really don't get as much into the log as you would with the Humbolt, where basically I'd actually be up a little higher. I might lose another 4 inches with that style of cut. Now out west it don't matter, but out here, you know, I'm not sure it matters. It's just what I've done forever. And as I've said for a whole bunch of times, I'm not going to tell you what's right for you. You know, everyone does their own damn thing. You know, the only thing I can do is show you what I do. No more, no less. I'm not saying it's the right way. I'm just saying it's what I do. And I'll tell you why. But I've tried, you know, a variety of different kinds of cuts and kind of settled on this. You know, either doing this with a no bore cut from the front on trees like maple and these, and then with a bore cut up front if I'm worried about pulls on things like hickory, some cherry, and ash. So anyway, let me go buck the top. Now there's another cut that I do is I'll come down from the top, and I'll pull back a little bit, and then I'll pull down, leave a little hold wood in there, go back in the bottom and drop out the bottom, especially if I'm not sure which way it's going to go. And then I'll see what the tree does, and then I can either cut from the top or the bottom. But what happens is when I make that final cut, it'll close up before it pinches a saw on a decent sized log like this one right here. So let me go do that, and that way I don't need a wedge. So that's one basswood down, and let's go for the ash. Now there's only one buyer around me that'll take the basswood. So, but he also gets me good money on the ash. So that determines who's going to get this load of lumber, right? You know, one thing I continually do, is I put my axe in the leaves. One of the things I need to do is wrap this thing with bright yellow tape or something, because I will lose it. But that goes into that whole concept that I was just talking about. You know, coming up with a system, and the saws are a piece of the system, but the wedges are, the wedge driver is, the chain, the bar, things like that. Wrap handle, in fact, hurt me a little bit, but not enough to matter. But those smaller bucking spikes helped me a little bit, and that does matter. That muffler mod might add a little bit of power because it makes it more fun to run, but it's a neutral in the sense that it doesn't add so much power that, you know, it's earth-shattering, but it does add a little fun to the saw. But the part that's more important to me is it does all of that, but doesn't detract from the use of the saw. You know what I'm saying? I was able to cut those stumps. I was able to mill with that saw. I was able to noodle with that saw where you have to rock it into the wood, and it didn't get in the way or get dented because of that operation. So that's what I'm talking about, total saw concept, you know, and how the mods either add to or subtract from. They might enhance one characteristic, but take away from others to the point where it's not worth doing. And I've just been trying to come up with a balance, you know, where I don't stress the reliability of the saw so much that I've shortened its life. Kind of like with 372s, it's been proven to me over time that the 6202 bearing and crank and the case system can only handle so much. You add too much compression or an out of balance piston, kind of like the early X-Torque, even the XPWs. What happens is that's stressed that bottom end more than it can really handle. And while it doesn't happen in a week, it might lose a year of use because the bearing pockets get pounded out. I've had 2 XPWs that were just like the early X-Torques, where basically the bearing pockets were open right up. And one of the XPWs, the actual case screws themselves were backed out. And the reason why the saw stopped running was it sucked so much air from between the cases it failed. It wouldn't run anymore. And when I tore it apart, not only were the cases rattled apart, but the bearing pockets were opened up, so that it was just useless. And that was because, I think, a lot of use, number one, but also the piston was a little heavy relative to the crank on that saw. And I saw the same thing with X-Torques. You know, Husky has since changed that. They changed things like the crank pin and the wrist pin and stuff like that, where they balance them a lot better. And the later versions of that X-Torque are just as reliable as anything on the market. I want to stress that. Some of the early ones were not, but they worked it out. That's what they do. It's what any of the reputable companies do. Still does as well. So anyway, on to the next one. Now notice it's leading back, so this is definitely a wedge job. And here's another little point, is when I do the face cut, again, I'm not telling you how to do it, I'm just telling you what I do, is let's say I have the hinge right there, right? I've got a longer distance to the back to actually use as a crowbar or a lever to wedge that tree up and over. So, especially when it's leading like this, I am going to have an open face cut. Yeah, I'll bore cut the front so it won't pull, but I'll make it shallow, and that gives me, when I get the wedge back there, an extra couple of inches of leverage to push that tree up over the wedge. That's something I don't think people really think about, you know. So let's just see if it works.